It was a pretty lonely job for a period of time. People that had known me my whole life that were calling and saying, Christy, get in line with these other governors. You know, this is going to be politically destruction for you.
Today I sit down with the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, the only governor to never lock down businesses during the COVID pandemic.
At the end of the day, I wanted to make sure that I could look back years from now and be proud of the fact that I did my job and only my job. If leaders do overstep their authority, especially in a time of crisis, that's when we break this country. And I didn't want to be that person.
We discuss her life, COVID policy, transgender athletes in women's sports, and the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Her new book is titled Not My First Rodeo, Lessons from the Heartland.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Governor Kristi Noem, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Oh, it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
It might be surprising to people that you would say that working on a farm, growing up on a farm, and everything that goes with that is actually something that has helped you in politics. And I might add the Snow Queen competition.
Oh my goodness,
right?
yes.
But the farm is the thing that just, I think there's a lot of people who simply might not understand. So why don't you give me an outline here?
Well, I think it's good for people to know that I grew up with a dad who was a cowboy. Very matter of fact. We never talked about politics at all. Nobody in my family is involved in government or the political arena. We lived our politics. You know, I tell the story quite often about when South Dakota passed a seatbelt requirement. I remember never having the discussion about it. I just remember seeing my dad cut the seatbelts out of his pickup. And I asked him about it because he wore his seatbelt, but he wasn't that he didn't like seatbelts, it was that he was mad the government was going to tell him he had to. And those kinds of things make an impression on you when you're young. He always consistently said, we don't complain about things, we fix them. And it wasn't really until he passed away in an accident, and we got hit with the death tax, which was a very unfair tax at the time. We almost lost our family business because of that tax, that I started to show up at meetings. Got passionate about tax reform, got involved based on the fact that my dad said we don't complain about things, we fix them. So there's a lot of lessons on a ranch. Teamwork, learning and watching animals, trying to figure them out, teaches you a lot about the behaviors of people, that words have consequences and an impact, and also just what challenges and how to figure it out. Very much living the kind of lifestyle that we lived turned us into problem solvers. You know, you tackle a problem, figure it out, and it builds your confidence to take on the next biggest one that comes your way.
And then, so what about this Snow Queen competition? I mean, I can kind of imagine, right, what that is. You describe it a little bit, but...
Well, you know, it's really strange, and it's one of those things I don't talk about very much, but I decided I had to put it in my book because people were going to bring it up and ask me why it wasn't there if I didn't. But, you know, in South Dakota, there's always been this Snow Queen competition for decades and decades. And what happens back when I was in high school was every senior girl at the local level competed. It gave you a chance to learn how to do an interview, which helped you with, you know, jobs later or college. You gave speeches, you learned how to introduce yourself. And also when you won, you got scholarships to school. So most young women were looking for an opportunity to go get a higher education, and you got the use of a car for a year. So having a free car for a year isn't a bad thing. So most everybody competed. I happened to end up winning the local contest and went to the state level one, which had 52 girls in it at the time. And when I won, it was a shock. In fact, I remember the headlines the next day said, "Farm girl wins Snow Queen," because it was just a very different thing for me to be doing. But I spent the next year traveling the country talking about South Dakota, you know, being a representative, an ambassador for the state, learning how to give speeches and interviews. So it was probably a very good preparation for the job that I do today. And from the time I was young, I knew a lot about South Dakota.
But at that time, you weren't thinking Congress, governor, or even...
No, I was thinking a free car looked pretty good. And it was a Grand Am with a sunroof. So, you know, that's not a bad thing.
Something that really comes through in this book, which kind of touched me actually, was how important your husband was in your decision making. And that, you know, you're obviously a very type A woman.
I am.
You're on top of things. You know what you want. But it seems like your husband's role is actually pretty important in this, and this isn't you playing alone. So, and this again also might be a surprise to some.
I think so too. You know, it's interesting. Our faith is incredibly important to us, and Scripture specifically talks about, you know, a husband and a wife and the relationship that should be there. So even though I'm a very quick decision maker, I typically know what I want to do, have plans, and go after them wholeheartedly. I knew that being married and having a husband was a teammate and a partner for me and a source of wisdom. So most of the time, he is the balance to me. He's the one that slows me down and puts a lot of thought into prayer into every decision that we make. I also knew that when he married me, he thought I was going to be a rancher the rest of my life. So the fact that we are where we are today is pretty incredible. But he is more willing to really look at the long-reaching effects of the decisions that I make. You know, if you run for this office, what does that mean for our family? What does that mean for how our holidays will look? What does that mean for how do I take care of these children when you're gone for 4 days in a row? And that's good things to do, because for me, my tendency is just to say yes. Somebody asks me to do something, I'll say, yeah, absolutely. And if they give me 3 options, according to him, I always pick the hardest one. He said, there's something about you where, you know, if people tell you 3 different things to do, you pick the hardest one to do. And I tend to say to him, well, it's always the right one. And he said it may be, but it's always the hardest one. And that means that there's going to be a ripple effect of consequences for him and the kids too.
There's an interesting principle there too, because I think in our society today, many of us definitely try to take the path of least resistance. You're almost taught that that's the way one should be. So what do you think?
I think that is a big result of the influence of my parents. My dad demanded excellence. You know, we got into a fight one time when I think I was already married. It was an argument over how we fed the cows, which sounds kind of funny, but you do chores twice a day. And when you do that, you give the cattle mineral to mix with the feed. But I had just finished doing chores in the morning, had a half a bag of mineral left, and I wanted to leave it buy the rest of the feeds, because when I came back in literally 2 hours, I would need it again. My dad, though, required that it be carried back, put in the shed, so it was covered up and put away properly. And then in 2 hours, I could go back to that shed, get it, and take it back out to the feed. For me, that seemed inefficient and ridiculous when I was going to be dealing with this in just 2 hours' time. But that's the difference. Is the responsible thing to do is when you use things, put them away, even if it was going to be needed shortly later. But that was what I was raised in, that no matter what, even if it's harder, it takes you a little bit more time to do things right, you do it right all the time. You do it correctly. You do things with excellence and be proud of the work that you do. And that may be a result of me always, why I choose the hardest thing all the time, is if it is the right thing, it's worth doing.
It seems like whenever these tough decisions come along, and you've made an effort to put this into the book, so obviously it's very important to you, is there's this, you know, you're making the decision with your husband, you're consulting with people, but you're also consulting with
God, and we're also consulting with God and sometimes arguing with him. Yeah. You know, there's times that I feel like I very much know what God wants me to do. And my biggest desire is to be obedient. You know, I want to live a life of significance. I want to live a life that is relevant and makes a difference. But I also recognize that I still feel like I'm not meeting my full purpose of what I'm supposed to be doing, which is a very difficult thing to be married to, I think, because my husband thinks I'm very busy already. He sees me working 20 hours a day and says, how could you possibly do more? And can't you just come home and, you know, make a meal, you know, spend some time watching TV? So that is a little bit of the challenge, but you know, God is an important part of our life, and I think that is often how Brian and I end up coming together on a decision. Is we may take us longer both to arrive at the same decision, but we both have a heart to do what God would have for our family, and that's how we usually end up at the end of the day making those important decisions.
There's a lot of people in America who don't have that relationship, or even maybe worry about people who do have it, frankly,
Yeah.
right? And, you know, you're acting as a representative for everybody. I mean, and maybe I'll ask you later if that you plan to be want to be a representative for even more people, but than just South Dakota. But how do you square that? How do you talk to folks that are
Well, I
thinking
think it's
this?
key that the people not judge each other for where they're at. You know, I think that's where we end up in problems. I see a lot of Christians today that say they have a strong faith that don't act like it. They don't love people. They hold other people to a higher standard than they do themselves. So that really is, you know, I think that what this country's struggling with. I certainly have a strong faith. It gives me my value system. I make my decisions from there, and I am pretty plain and honest about what those are. Then I ask people to support me for office. I hope that they'll understand who I am. And then, you know, I'll serve them. And if they appreciate what I've done, then maybe they'll support me again. But I think if people aren't Christians, if they don't have the same faith that I do, the most important thing that I can do is still love them and want to work for them. We lose sight of that quite often in this country. We get judgmental of people and assume that they aren't as important as we are. And that's just not even scriptural. That's not even American.
Yeah, and you include this moment in the book where I think you say it's embarrassment and you're wishing failure and embarrassment on President Obama, and then you stop yourself. And yeah.
Well, you know, it was during when I first got to Congress. I had been there, I think, 2 years, and it came time to listen to President Obama's State of the Union speech. And as a representative, that's always a circus, you know, because you have to get there a couple of hours early, get through security, you sit on the House floor board waiting for it to stay. It's a lot, or start. It's a lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of jumping to your feet and clapping, and I just didn't want to go. I had a bad attitude. I wasn't happy with some of the decisions the president was making. My chief of staff was, well, you have to go. If you aren't there, it doesn't look good. It looks like you don't respect the president. And I agreed and went. But I remember standing at the back of the House floor listening to President Obama's talk and being angry. I was listening to him thinking he's lying, he's not telling the truth. And I started to pray, you know what, God, I hope he screws up. I hope he misspeaks. You know, maybe even what he's saying, hopefully the American people aren't understanding, you know, confuse his speech. And just, I really was in a bad spot as far as where my heart was. And I remember within just a minute or two immediately feeling convicted that I was doing the exact opposite of what God had called me to do. I mean, it's pretty clear in the Bible that you're supposed to pray for your leaders, not against them. And here I was having the honor of standing on the United States House of Representatives floor, watching the President of the United States give a speech, and I was praying against him, and I felt horrible. So that fixed my attitude that night. I started to pray for him, and I thought, you know, we think so much that all is lost in this country. All it takes is God to change a couple of hearts. Imagine if you did have a leader in the country or even in your state that had a hard heart, that was bitter and angry and cold, God can change that overnight. And if their heart is changed, think of how their decisions would change. Think of how their leadership would change. So we forget about the miracle that so many of us believe in, that it actually still could happen today and a life could be changed.